preaching career, I think if we were new preachers, it'd be a little bit different. As far as books, I still like books. I still like something I can actually see in the sense of have my hands on. But yeah, I read something the other day that was online as well. I guess there are times that I don't completely fully trust.
Mark, I'm just going to throw it out there. You're an old preacher.
I am.
What it comes down.
I am. I'm sorry I put you in the same category. Yeah, that's right. I'm bound for glory. This train's bound for glory. That's right.
You may look younger than me and be in better shape than me, but let's just be clear.
So, but
yeah, I just but here, I will say this: the thing about memory is that your memory is a lot of times locational, so that you remember where something is, and that's why the paper is valuable. But
that's true. You remember what side, like even in the Bible, a lot of times you're used to a translation. It's like, okay, I know that passage is left hand down below.
Right.
I mean, that's where certainly Bible Gateway has made finding passages a lot easier. And there is a sense, I don't know, Brian, when I started out, I was handwriting all my sermons. I mean, this would have been, this would have been like 1980, handwriting my sermons. Then we went to Sears and got a typewriter and did that for a while. When I showed up in Forest Grove, someone gave me, was it an Apple II? It had two separate little disk drives.
Yeah.
Had a little printer, I had a Pong game on it, that I never played. And then I tell you what, Brian, my favorite word processing would be the round ball. It was the round ball typewriter. It would have been like, they had them in high school, mid 70s, the ball that rotated when it typed.
Yeah. I know what you mean. I do know what you mean. Yeah.
I love that machine. It was like butter. It was smooth. Of course, you had to get like the white thing, the correct, and the white out. And so
here's my thing is, how did the apostles do their work without an iPad? I got to have all that kind of stuff. And welcome to the Answering Religious Error Show. My name is Brian Garlock. So glad you could join us today. This is our live Bible Q&A. So if you have a Bible question, now's the time to email us questions at answeringreligiouserror.com, or you can private message us on our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/answeringreligiouserror. We'd love to hear from you today. We have several questions that we have already received and are lined up, ready to go. But if you send us a question in live, we will do our very best to get to it. Again, that's questions at answeringreligiouserror.com, or private message us on our Facebook page, facebook.com/answeringreligiouserror. We do want to quickly talk about the Daily Answer. It's Monday through Friday at 5 a.m. is when the episode drops. So that's with our beloved Mark Dunnigan, who's on the panel today. And if you're looking for some encouragement, something to challenge you as you're getting ready for work, as you're going to work, we'd encourage you to go to our podcast channel. You can find that on all major podcast platforms. And that is, again, the Daily Answer with Mark Dunnigan. He just reached his 102nd episode, I believe it is. And so he is chugging along and just doing a great job with giving those episodes to us, just about his daily life, about his life as a child, and just throwing some biblical principles in there. So we'd encourage you to check that out, the Daily Answer, Monday through Friday at 5 a.m. Eastern Time. Gentlemen, it's good to see you today. Looking forward to the answers to the questions that you have. How are y'all doing? Everybody good? Nick's filling in for Bob, and Terry's out today. We've got Brian, Stephen, Mark. Guys, how are y'all doing?
Yes, Brian, we're doing it. You look like a grocery store during COVID, except there needs to be one product up there that everyone said, even if I have to starve, I'm not buying a can of that.
Was it the tofu or something? Is that what it was?
No, it was interesting seeing, Brian, it was the Fred Meyer in Cornelius. I think it was the Friday after things really blew up in COVID. And it was certain canned food items like orphans that were left on the shelves that it's like, or it was some frozen burrito bowl in the frozen food section. Like, nah, I think I'd rather starve.
Yeah, I can feel that one. All right, this is our live Bible Q&A. Let's have a word of prayer. Nick, will you lead us in that, please?
Bow with me, please. Our Holy Father who is in heaven, we come before your throne today, grateful for this opportunity to be able to share your word with those who are listening in and who will tune in later. We are grateful that you have blessed us with an opportunity to be able to work through this medium, to be able to reach so many people abroad. And we are grateful, Father, that you have given us your word to be able to study and to learn and to grow from. We pray for wisdom as we study and as we share your gospel to others. We pray that we will encourage people to continue to seek your truth and learn more about you, and ultimately be baptized and have their sins washed away by the blood of Christ, so that they can be reconciled back into you, be restored and made fully whole, and to avoid your wrath. Thank you, Father, for all that you have blessed us with. Be with those who are listening. We pray, Father, for their strength and their courage throughout these days. And Father, it's in your Son's name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Appreciate that prayer, brother. All right, this is our live Bible Q&A. Email us questions at answeringreligiouserror.com or private message us on our Facebook page, facebook.com/answeringreligiouserror. If you just post on a video that you see shared on Facebook, we might not see your comments, so we would love to be able to reach you today and answer those questions. So email us or private message us. But first, it is meme time. And I know that notice that Terry has joined us. Good to see you there, brother. All right, today's meme that's floating around on Facebook. Can God create a rock so heavy even he cannot lift? That's a question that many people have had throughout the years. If yes, then he's not all powerful. If not, then he's not all powerful. I can't get the word out. Of course, this would happen to me live on air. But, omnipotence, there we go, is a myth. We'll go with that word there. Nick, let's start with you if you want to.
Well, when you look at this meme, it reminds me of what Roy Cogdon would have said years ago, that whatever proves too much doesn't prove a thing. This really gets and drives to this idea of something that is just ridiculous, illogical. I mean, you know, what would it take for God to continue to make an increasingly larger rock? You know, there's no end to it, right? I mean, because God is infinite, and he would have to create something that's infinite, which is just an illogical fallacy. It's kind of like trying to say that there is a triangle with two sides. You know, could he create a triangle with two sides, which is illogical fallacy? And so when it comes to something that just proves too much, it really doesn't prove much at all. I mean, look at philosophy. This is coming from the minds of men trying to create a trap. And man's philosophy has always tried to create these hypothetical conundrums. Like one that goes through that's kind of popular nowadays is, are we in a I just lost the word. It's like the Matrix. Are we in the Matrix? Can we prove that we're not in the Matrix? And of course we can't. And so therefore, you know, there's nothing that's proven with it. And so that's where I keep going back to when I see stuff like this is just, let's just be real and logical, and let's get to the real meat of the problem, not try to create these hypothetical, illogical, out there off the beaten path kind of things.
Appreciate it. Go ahead, Brian.
Yeah, you know, it's kind of interesting. Becky actually makes a comment in our chat that was a comment that I thought of too. One of the problems here is that somebody is trying to define omnipotence by their own standard and then throw it at God and make it stick to God. There's a lot of things the Bible talks about God doesn't do. One of the things I was thinking about is what Becky said. The scriptures say God cannot lie. God cannot tolerate sin. God cannot be unjust. We can go down a list of the characteristics of God, of things that God cannot do. What this person is trying to do, again, is to define their own version of omnipotence and then force it towards God. And yet there's a lot of characteristics about God that are illogical to human understanding. God is three persons and one person. That's illogical by any way that we would put this together. Jesus was completely God and completely man. He existed and existed beforehand. There's so many different things about the nature of God that don't fit into our reasoning because our reasoning is finite. The very idea that we truly can't even comprehend eternity, which is the existence, is where God exists, that our brain doesn't even work that way, really kind of makes an idea like omnipotence silly to try to define. So really what we have to consider here is that this is a child's argument, where a child is defining their own words and their own ideas. And, God would laugh if it wasn't for the fact that somebody probably thought they were pretty smart in coming up with this.
Appreciate it. Mark, got anything?
Brian makes an excellent observation. The meme completely misses Genesis 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That is, God spoke the entire universe into existence from nothing. That's omnipotence. And it's not this is not a new argument. It's been around for a long, long time. But Brian makes a killer point. Yeah, you're being a child and you're coming up with a child's version of omnipotence. Time to grow up and start reading the Bible.
All right, appreciate those comments, guys. All right, if you need any more clarification on this meme, we'd appreciate you reach out to us. Again, questions at answeringreligiouserror.com, or private message us on our Facebook page. And if you have a meme that you see going around, occasionally we have people send memes in that they have questions about, so you can do the same, and we'd love to hear from you and answer that meme for you. All right, our first question for today, a question persuading me and making me most confused. We are serving multiple cups using in the act of the Lord's Supper and the worship. A group of people came to our area and confusing us with their teachings, using one cup as authoritative in the worship authored by Jesus Christ. Which one is correct? If one is correct, the other must be wrong. Which one is correct according to the Word of God? Appreciate the question. We get this question quite often, actually. So apparently it is something that is bothering many people. But let's have an answer for this brother here. Terry, start with you. And you're muted there, brother.
Couldn't get my thing over there. All right. I'm looking at Luke 22, verse 17. Says he took the cup. Now, we don't know what that is right now. Is it the container? And he gave thanks. And he said, take this and divide it, the cup. Divide the cup among yourselves. Now, is he saying divide a container? If he's not saying divide a container, then that blows the argument away that there is a demand for one container and that this verse is talking about it. No, this verse is talking about the content. The fruit of the vine is the cup. That's the cup Jesus wanted divided. Now, to divide it, they had to pour it into their own individual containers. And so what we have then is Jesus saying, divide this among yourselves. Whatever it takes to divide that content, that fruit of the vine, the cup, whatever it takes to divide it among yourselves is what the Lord wants us to do. Now, if you all you got is one container and you can't divide it one way, you find another way. You might say, well, we've got one container, but maybe I'll take a sip and then pass it to this guy. And so you can divide it that way, but it's not that the Lord is saying divide it by each taking a sip, but divide it among yourselves. And then he says to drink the cup. All right. So what it seems to me that the most expedient and the most helpful thing is what it appears that they did. That is, they poured it among themselves individually, and then were able to take that cup. So no, there is no demand for one container. If so, then in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, Paul talks about the cup that we drink, and he's writing from Ephesus to the brethren at Corinth. And he's implying, or is he saying here, the cup which we drink, we, meaning all Christians everywhere, drink this cup. What cup do we drink? Well, we don't drink the same container. We drink the same content no matter where we are. So if there is a demand for one container, then every Christian all over the world would have to drink from the same singular container. You can't just say, well, each congregation can have their own. No, that's not what he's saying. The cup which we, that means you at Corinth and us over here at Ephesus and brethren everywhere, no matter where they're located, drink the same cup. And that, therefore, is an indication that it doesn't matter about the container. We're talking about the content. And if you're drinking fruit of the vine, you're drinking the cup. Those are my thoughts.
All right, appreciate that. I think it was covered well. Anyone else, though, before we move on? Okay. Next question that we have here. Are the animals of Job 40 in verse 15 and 41 in verse 1 literal? That's a good question. Because if you read the text, there's a lot of interesting things about these animals mentioned. You're smiling big, Stephen. Go ahead.
Well, and my first answer is yes, they are literal. And my second answer is they are being used figuratively. I think that God is describing it. It would not be, it would not accomplish anything to use imaginary creatures to make the arguments that God is making. The argument that he is making is about his control over creation. That's really the argument he's been making since he began speaking at the beginning of his speeches to Job. And he is first started with really all of creation, starting with the heavenly bodies, the oceans, and then various creatures that we would be more familiar with. And then he kind of singles out these two monumental creatures, the behemoth and the Leviathan. And I do think that especially the Leviathan represents sort of the wickedness. I think it's the idea of a dragon, something like that. And we see the word dragon used in other places. In fact, I think dragon would probably be a good way to translate serpent in Genesis chapter 3. And so I do think it is representative. But I don't think an imaginary creature is being used to represent something. I think an actual creature, and that's the way it's laid out. Look, he's pointing to something that they can see in order to say something about his own power. I do think that that quick dismissal of these animals as literal is not being very fair with the text. I don't think it's being very fair with the arguments. And I also think that it comes from a place of assuming that when we look around us today, we have representations of all the animals that have ever lived. We, in our own lifetimes, have seen or can see the extinction of animals, much less add thousands of years. So the notion that these could not be creatures that are no longer in existence is an absurdity. Of course, there could be creatures that existed then that could be described in these ways that don't exist now. And so I think we need to leave room for that. In fact, I think that's the most likely interpretation.
All right.
Brian, there's a number of real animals leading up to those chapters. Like in chapter 39, there's the mountain goats. Not only that, but there is the wild donkey. There's also the wild ox in verse 9 that is extinct. That I think maybe the last one was seen around the time of Julius Caesar. And so we might say, well, I don't see behemoth and Leviathan on the earth. Okay, we may see the remains, on the earth in the fossil record. but the wild ox isn't on the earth any longer either. So, I mean, everything leading up to this are real animals. And not only that, but in chapter 40, God says, I made behemoth just like I made you. Is that Job? You know, if if these are not literal, then was Job literal? Was Job real? And so to me, that's kind of and just the language of the text is that an argument is being made, a point is being made from real things on the face of the earth. I think a number of people that hold to evolution are very uncomfortable with the idea of something like a dinosaur being on the earth at the same time as man. But that's just a human theory that denies that. I think there's evidence biblically, like in these chapters, and in the fossil record, that man and the dinosaurs did interact. Those are my thoughts.
Hey, appreciate it. Good stuff. All right, next question. All right, Terry, did you have something? You want to open your mouth?
No, it was covered well.
Okay. If an intruder is in the home of a Christian and causing severe problems, does the Christian have to endure it, or can the Christian stand up to them even if it means getting violent? A friend told me she heard about a Christian couple that believed they cannot fight back. So these guys took advantage of them for years by making them give money, food, and even doing sexual things with the wife. Man, it seems it would be wrong to allow that to happen over and over again. Thanks. All right. Brian, we haven't heard from you yet, so let's start with you.
You bet. Very interesting question. And there is I appreciate the question, because there's a certain logic of, well, if we turn the other cheek, doesn't that mean, where does that stop? Well, we have to always kind of say, what are the bookends of these kinds of conversations? On one side of this, we find in the law of Moses that there was a very distinct conversation about the laws of self-defense. You go back to Exodus chapter 22, it talks about the idea if somebody breaks in your home at night and you take their life, that was a reasonable thing to do. Whereas during the daytime, when the ambiguity of what they're doing is not there, that to take their life, when you could run, when you could do other things, wasn't. I like that as one side of this conversation, to say God had seen, the importance of these circumstances and how they can be unusual under different times and different elements. On the other side of this, in the book of Luke, chapter 22, we see that the apostles themselves carried weapons for self-defense. In Luke chapter 22 and verse 38, they were carrying swords with themselves. And the idea was that, you did that for self-defense. They had Jesus with them, and yet it was still an appropriate thing for them to have this. So we say that the scriptures on both sides of this are telling us that there's a reasonable limit to what we accept from people. So when I look at something like turn the other cheek, I look at that within the confines of Jesus is talking about, somebody asking things of you, demanding things of you, and to what degree, not so much the idea of just let bad things happen. We're supposed to not accept that. Instead, it's to say, don't let things that are worldly be that important to you. If somebody wants your jacket, give it to them. If somebody, don't let worldly things, the things that are around you, have that much value to you. And I would say that's really what we need to see in turning the other cheek, that, somebody insults me, somebody strikes me. I'm not, Jesus would want us to consider that that's not that big a thing. And, it's okay to let things like that go. He's not saying, hey, I expect you to never raise your hand in self-defense, not when he expected that of his own apostles.
Stephen, what you
got? Muted, that's what I've got. So a couple of passages that I think are helpful here. One is Exodus chapter 22. In Exodus chapter 22, beginning in verse 2, we've got the situation of someone breaking into your house, a thief breaking into your house. And if you kill the thief in the act of breaking into your house, it says there shall be no blood guiltiness. Now, it does say if you go tracking down after the sun's come up the next day, then you will be guilty. And so the idea is that there being laid out is you have the right to protect your home and hearth. You don't have the right to take justice in your hand and become a vigilante the next day. I would add to that in Matthew chapter 24. In Matthew 24, And just by way of illustration, I think sometimes a question like this, we're looking for a specific. I think Exodus 22 kind of does give us some specifics, but we want a specific passage that lays this out. But I think this is the sort of thing where the Bible assumes certain aspects all along the way. And the Bible assumes, for instance, private property. It doesn't have this long treatise like we have kind of in American history on the notion of private property. It assumes it. It assumes it when it says that when it condemns being a thief. Right? It assumes that the other person has a right to his things and you don't have a right to those things. So I think sometimes we would prefer that the Bible just lay it all out, but we kind of have to ferret out based on what's assumed. So in Matthew 24, I think there's an assumption. As Jesus is talking about judgment, he says, "Be sure of this: if the head of the house had known at what time of the night the thief was coming, he would have stayed awake and would not have allowed his house to be broken into." Now, his point is not about self-defense here, but he is assuming self-defense, right? So he is assuming that his audience understands that obviously everyone protects their home, and especially the man of the house protects his home. And he says, if he had been given warning, he would not have allowed his house to be broken into. Now, I don't think what Jesus has in mind is that the head of the house would have gone to the front door and politely asked the thief not to enter. He's going to take what actions are necessary to keep the invader out of his home. And so I think particularly man of the house has that primary responsibility to protect not only his home, but all those who are in his home, his wife and his children. They are under his protection. And so I think the Bible does give some specific instruction, but I think even more than that, it just assumes this principle of the right to self-protection and protection of those who are under your protection.
I appreciate it, Mark.
Yeah, this is. I'm going to file this away, and this is not a negative comment on the person asking the question. They're saying, "I heard of this scenario," but this has to be in my top 10 of weirdest scenarios I've ever heard. Okay, what's going on here? I mean, are these Christians that are allowing this to happen? If so, where's the local congregation? I mean, where are the elders and where's the church? Like, hey, we got people in our house that are, doing this and doing that and doing things with my wife. I mean, where's everybody else in this scenario? I don't know. What I did want to comment upon, great comments by Brian and Stephen. I did want to go back to that turn the other cheek passage is a contrast to in Matthew chapter 5, verse 38 to the Pharisees' view of their time that the overarching rule for them was eye for an eye, which was a abuse of the passage that never allowed you to go and take your own revenge. But that's the way they were applying it. It more was for the judges in Israel to make sure that proper consequences were meted out for their appropriate crime. But it never allowed you to be a vigilante. And so in contrast to that is turn the other cheek. But turn the other cheek never meant let evil men do whatever they want. In Ephesians 5:11, we're told to rebuke, expose the unfruitful works of darkness. And in Romans 13, civil government has a sword. And civil government is a minister. And it's like someone gets into your house, you call your minister, your servant. Civil government is a servant of the people. And it's there, and it's there for you to call upon them when you need help. Paul would appeal to Caesar. Paul would appeal to the appropriate laws of the land for protection. So I don't know. This one's making my head spin about what these people were thinking. So I don't know. But it's right up there in the top 10 of. Besides the Bible being against it, is there any other reason not to do it? It has to be with that question, too. Those are my thoughts, Brian.
Appreciate it. Nick, go ahead.
Yeah, kind of follow up there with what Mark is saying. One of my main thoughts is going to Romans chapter 13, where it says that the governing authorities does not bear the sword in vain. And the governing authorities, especially here in the United States, I know there are different laws around the world, and even from state to state, there's going to be different laws. But from Kentucky, where I'm from, the governing authorities understands that they can't be there at that very moment to protect you during an intruder or when there is a threat against your person or your family. And for me personally, if it's just me by myself, I probably won't take those actions to take a life or whatever it may be to defend myself. I will turn that other cheek as much as I can when I am being persecuted for the cause of Christ. But let me tell you, if somebody is going to threaten my family, you're going to have to get through me first, and I will be dangerous. And because the government gives me the authority to protect my family. And as someone breaks into my home or we're out and about, there's a reason why the governing authorities here in the United States allows us to defend ourselves, because they know the police and the other authorities can't get there in time. And so, there is that arm of the governing authorities practicing and executing their right to bear the sword, and they're doing that through us to defend ourselves. And so I see that as a very legitimate answer to this self-defense part of the equation. Now, looking at that one part where it says that these people are forcing them to give money and food, that's one thing, because, in of itself, giving food or money, that's not sinful. It could be unwise, and it could be enabling them to not be responsible. But the sexual activity, that is a sin, and you should stand up for that. You should never be forced to do anything sinful. You should resist to the point of bloodshed, is what the Hebrew writer says in Hebrews 12. And so don't be afraid to stand up for what is right. Do not be ashamed to call yourself a Christian. And if there is something going on like that, you need to reach out to some higher authority. If this is happening in the church, definitely take it to the eldership. If this is happening outside of the church, and in both cases, you probably, if there's sexual molestation, that needs to be addressed civilly.
All right. Appreciate those comments there, guys. I hope that helps. Our next question here that we have, what's the difference? And this is an easy one. What's the difference between a pastor and a preacher? So we get a little bit of a break from those other questions. Terry, let's start with you.
Well, all pastors are preachers, but not all preachers are pastors. For example, Timothy was a preacher, told to preach the word. But in 1 Timothy, Paul's letter to him, he speaks of those who are elders. Same word for, and there are several words. You can look at Acts 20, verse 17 through 28, and you can see that they are shepherds. Shepherd and pastor is the same thing. So these men have certain qualifications, and 1 Timothy chapter 3 lists those qualifications. And those qualifications is that if in order to be a pastor or a shepherd or an elder, those are words referring to the same office. When Timothy, a preacher, appointed these men, they had to have these qualifications, and the qualifications included that he must be the husband of one wife. Well, all preachers don't have to be married, but all pastors do. All elders have to be married. And so he goes through a list of things that are true of those who would be pastors, that are shepherds or elders, that doesn't have to be true of every preacher. Timothy didn't have to be married. He didn't have to have children. And so the list of qualifications to be a preacher is faithfulness to the Lord and the faithfulness to his word. That's the qualifications to be a preacher. Now, a pastor can preach. He can be a preacher, but all preachers can't be pastors. So there's the difference between one is overseeing the group and he's ruling over the flock, trying to take care of their souls with the authority to exercise any disciplinary measures that he needs to, but all preachers can't do that. So every pastor is a preacher, but every preacher is not a pastor. Okay.
Brian, to me, one of the verses that has been helpful with this is in Acts 20, verse 17, Paul is addressing the elders of the church at Miletus, at the town of Miletus. But in verse 28, he says to that same group of men to guard the flock among which the Holy Spirit hath made you overseers. And so there's your word for bishop. So an elder is an overseer / bishop, same office. To shepherd, there's the concept of pastor. And I see the same thing in 1 Peter chapter 5, where Peter speaks of himself as a fellow elder, and the elders are told in verse 2 to shepherd the flock. So elders, pastor, elders are the pastors, exercising oversight. Elders are the bishops or the overseers. So pastor, shepherd, elder, bishop, overseer, those titles describe the same group of men, as Terry noted in 1 Timothy chapter 3 and Titus 1, that have very specific qualifications, including husband of one wife and having children that believe. Noted, an evangelist preaches the word, but an evangelist or a preacher doesn't have to be married. He doesn't have to have any children. He can be, but he's to preach the word. So they are distinctly different in that sense.
All right. Appreciate those comments. For those who are at home watching live, if you have a Bible question, email us now, questions@answeringreligiouserror.com, or private message us on our Facebook page. Again, it's questions@answeringreligiouserror.com. And you can private message us on our Facebook page, facebook.com/answeringreligiouserror. Also, this show will be on podcast after after our live viewing here. And so if you want to listen to us on audio, you can do that on all major podcast platforms. All right, our next question that we have here. Please explain Luke 14, verse 26. If anyone comes to me and does not hate his father or mother and mother, his wife and children, his brothers and sisters, yes, even his own life, he cannot be my disciple. Does this mean I must deny myself? Thank you. Nick, let's start with you.
Yes, of course it means you must deny yourself. You need to put Christ first in your life. And if you put yourself first, who are you serving? You're serving yourself before you serve Christ. And that is idolatry. And at the end of the day, because you're worshiping the God of self. So when you look at this verse, the word hate is a very strong word. And I had a dear friend years ago where she was very much a pacifist. She was in the Peace Corps, through and through. And the concept that Jesus would have ever said, hate somebody, just really threw her for a loop. And I'm surprised that through all of her years, she never even come across this verse until I was talking to her about it. And we had a really good discussion. What does it mean to hate those different relationships? And it means to put them less, to put Christ first, and to have more love and devotion to Christ than you would those very important relationships that are dear to you naturally, such as your children or your parents or your spouse. And so there is that priority set that you need to make sure you have in your life. Who is that top priority, and then who's going to come after that. And oftentimes self is going to be that number one in people's lives. And that is, of course, a very dangerous priority list. Humble yourself or you will be made humbled.
Brian, obviously, yes, you must deny yourself, but what does that mean? And it doesn't necessarily mean that I'll just go on a diet of vegetables, or I will have just one coat or one pair of pants or whatever. Okay. There's a lot of people out there that practice all sorts of forms of self-denial that are not really what Jesus wants. What Jesus wants is that he comes first and his will comes first. That's what Jesus wants. That if it comes down between what Jesus says and my opinion and my feelings, I go with what Jesus said. If it comes down between what Jesus taught and the views of parents, I go with what Jesus said. Jesus said, he that believeth and is baptized shall be saved. Maybe got a lot of people out here that says you don't need to do that. Okay. Maybe my family says I don't need to do that. Maybe part of me says I really want to do that. But that's what he said. And that's really where the rubber meets the road if you're really a true disciple, is that when Jesus says to do something, you don't argue with it. You don't make excuses. You don't try to work your way around it. You accept it. You submit to it. You obey it. And so that's the true self-denial that Jesus is talking about in the passage, is that it's his will, not my will. It's his point of view, not my point of view. Those are my thoughts.
All right. Appreciate those things. Steven, you got something?
Yeah, a couple of things to add on to the good comments already. The idea of hated is pretty clearly put in terms of preference order. In a passage like Genesis chapter 29, in Genesis 29 and verse 31, it says, and Yahweh saw that Leah was unloved. That word unloved is the word hated there, and it is translated hated the vast majority of the times that it shows up in the Old Testament. But it's translated unloved here because when we think about Jacob's relationship with Leah, it's not this intense hatred. It is simply that he prefers her less than Rachel. And so a lower preference, of course, feels like hatred, especially in the instance of two wives, that here's a wife who is not treated with as much preference. And so, of course, she's going to be, it's going to feel like there's hatred. Well, it's the same thing with family. We hear a lot of people kind of state the cliche, family first. And God says, no, me first. And so family, when they are not first, may feel hated because they are not preferred first. I would put this also into the context of Genesis chapter 1, when a man, or Genesis chapter 2, when a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife. The word leave there is often translated forsake, turn your back on. So when you enter into a marriage, you see it happen there. Very often there are parents who are in some ways, I think, too attached to their children. And when they go marry another, they're not ready to let go. And yet the child is commanded to make that degree of separation. Now, that doesn't mean he doesn't still honor his father and mother, that he doesn't still care for them and make provisions for them. But he has formed a new household, and he has walked away from the old household. And that's appropriate and right and good. But it can feel like hatred. I just would add one more. Tom Holly gives an illustration and talks about, having lists. And it's not just like there's a list with God at the top. That's sort of like saying to your wife, if she saw a list somewhere and it said number 3, Jessica, and she'd say, well, first of all, who's Jessica? And second of all, who's number 2, right? And third of all, how many people are on the list? When you talk about wives, there's no list. There's only one name. And anybody else is on a different sort of list altogether. And it's the same way with God. He is not simply first on a list. He is his own list. And then everybody else is on a separate, distinct list that falls lower than that, including myself.
Appreciate that. That's good stuff, man. All right. Next question that we have for today. Here's a critical question asked by some people in the Bible study classes. The question, why did God allow to be born crippled into the world? Psalms 128:3 and James 1:17. Let me read those two passages here. It says, for Psalms 128 is, behold, children are a heritage from the Lord. The fruit of the womb is a reward. In James 1:17, it says, every good gift and every perfect gift is from above and comes down from the Father of lights. Okay, then why these syndromes are happening to his all humans are created by God people. Down syndrome, Turner syndrome, thalassemia, I hope I'm saying that correctly, Huntington's syndrome, and Duchenne's muscular dystrophy. Please help us to comprehend. Excuse me if I'm mispronouncing these words. I've never even heard the last one actually, but please help us to comprehend the truth and to teach others. 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 15 and 16. Stephen, let's start with you.
Brian, I don't think you're a doctor or that you stayed at a Holiday Inn Express last night.
I did not. I'm not good with pronouncing anything.
Nevertheless, I don't think I could have done any better. So the question of birth defects, of disease, and all sorts of difficulties, God addresses this head on. He does not sidestep this or pretend it doesn't exist. God has acknowledged all of these things, and in very frank ways. In Leviticus chapter 21, and beginning in verse 17, Leviticus 21 and beginning in verse 17, it says, "Speak to Aaron, saying, no man of your seed throughout their generations who has a defect shall come near to offer the food of his God. For no one who has a defect shall come near, a blind man or a lame man, or he who has a disfigured face or any deformed limb, or a man who has a broken foot or broken hand, or hunchback or a dwarf, or one who has a defect in his eye, or eczema, or scabs, or crushed testicles. No man among the seed of Aaron the priest who has a defect shall approach to bring near the offerings to Yahweh by fire. Since he has a defect, he shall not approach to bring near the food of his God." That is an offensive section of scriptures. And it's offensive, especially in our modern context. We don't even like to use these words anymore. We don't like to talk about people who are defective. We don't even like the word handicapped anymore. No matter what word we figure out to use to describe people who fall into this category, we eventually feel like that word is offensive, and we try to figure out ways to avoid saying that people have defects or diseases or whatever the case. God doesn't. He said all these things are defects, and these people will not be able to have that role in my service. And so how do we reconcile that with this picture of a loving God from whom all these good gifts come? Well, I think it has to do with the very theme of Leviticus, which is holiness. Holiness is about separation. And we think holiness is just about separation from sinful activities. It is. But it's about not only separation from the sinful activities, but ultimately it's about separation from the consequences of sinful activities. And these defects that God describes here are all consequences of sin. They are not necessarily the consequences of the sin of the individual who has the defect, or even necessarily of the sins of the parents of the one who has the defect. We know that on the occasion where Jesus comes to a blind man, that's the question: who sinned, this man or his parents? And the answer is neither, but someone did. And sin is what introduced defect. None of these things that are described here in Leviticus 21 are in the Garden of Eden. And what's more important to us, none of them will be in life eternal for those who come near to God. When we realize ultimate holiness, we will be separated not only from sin, but from all the consequences of sin.
Everybody's getting put out of this show except me on my, and I don't know if that's true. And
I think it's just you, Terry.
But I'm the only one showing up.
All right. Well,
I just muted him.
Okay.
Go ahead. That was really good too, and then he interrupted.
That's all right. So when we're looking here, think about it this way. Where you're looking through Leviticus 21, just insert these conditions in there. And God, I think, would say these conditions, they would not be allowed to serve. And it's because God is trying to paint a picture of what it is like to be in his presence. And what it is like to be in his presence is that there's no more sin and there's no more consequence of sin. The story that I like to connect here is one that of my nephew who was born with cerebral palsy, and he was incapable of communication. He was incapable of a great many things. And so he loved to hear singing. He loved to hear his siblings sing to him, but he could not sing with them. What this tells me is in God's presence, that cerebral palsy won't be there, but he will. One of the things that you see in Leviticus 21 is they still get to eat with God. They still get to have fellowship with God. And the picture is that in the ultimate picture, those who come before God's presence, there will be no defects. So when I see my nephew again, because he passed away at age 3, when I see him again, he will be able to sing without defect. Defect that he did not bring upon himself, but sin did bring into his life. I will be able to sing with him without defect. My defect is the self-inflicted kind, the kind that damaged my heart, but it'll all be gone. Both the self-inflicted and the worldwide sin inflicted. So it's really a beautiful picture. It is not an image of God simply wanting those things. He never wanted those things. And he's told us all along that I want the world, I want all people rid of those things. And ultimately, that's his goal, to have everyone who will to be in his presence, to be rid of sin and all its consequences.
Stephen, I've heard you, I've heard you tell that story before, and I really appreciate it. And I'm glad the audience got to hear that in relation to this question too. So, Nick, do you have something? Or who was talking?
I wanted to say something. I didn't realize what was going on. Everybody was blacked out except me just a moment ago, and I didn't know I was still on for sure. So anyway, I missed some of what Stephen was saying, but I think the gist of it was that defects entered because of the curse on the ground from Genesis chapter 3. And God doesn't see anything wrong, inherently wrong with humans having those defects. In fact, he said in Exodus chapter 4, verse 11, didn't I make the mute, the lame, and the blind? I made them. So they're still special people to God. They still have inherent value to God, and therefore they ought to have inherent value to the rest of us. So there's something we can learn from being of service to them. And by expressing our love for a creature made in God's image, even with the defects, that we learn something about precious love, and we learn from the innocence of a little child that has come into the world with these defects. They are teaching us. They're teaching us to value life. They're teaching us to value souls, and so those are valuable things. We need that in this training ground, and that's all we are, is in a training ground. It's an imperfect world, but it's a world that's perfect for training, and it's training us to be of a service to others. And if we can't learn service to others, there's something wrong with us, and the defect is inside our minds and in our hearts. So let's look at these as opportunities to show character and love, and grow in these areas of compassion and mercy. Those are things that we need inside. So it's character building opportunities that we need in a cursed ground, a ground that's going to have problems and thorns and thistles and that kind of thing. Those are my thoughts.
You know, Brian, often it's the outsider that looks on the individuals with these situations like Down syndrome. So why does God allow that to happen? But the person with Down syndrome often that's not their focus. You know, we need to be careful that we don't steal other people's stuff, you know, from the standpoint of like, I'm all bent out of shape because this child was born this way. But the child's not bent out of shape. I remember, I think it's the Sacred Selections, Dana has told a story about there were two kids, and you know, it's too late for an abortion, and one's Down syndrome. and the family doesn't want the Down syndrome child. And, a family comes along, and because they said, we'll take the good one. A Christian family comes along and takes that child. And that child now is a comfort to, just a joy to have around, a comfort. I don't know all, as we know, sin entered this world, and with it disease and genetic breakdown at time. I don't know all the reasons, but I think, it's interesting, Brian, that sometimes the people that have the biggest problems in this world, that is depression and mental problems, are perfect physical specimens. It's not the people with Down syndrome. And maybe it's one of those things that we appreciate. We look at someone that says, okay, they don't have all the faculties I have. I need to be grateful for what I have. Because I don't know, it just seems to me that it's not the people in the handicap category that seem to be the ones that are feeling sorry for themselves. It seems to be the people that are incredibly healthy and have all sorts of gifts and talents are the ones that are feeling sorry for themselves. And I think it's that they're just a silver lining here of gratitude. And you know what? There's somebody there that doesn't have all the talents and gifts that I was given. They seem a lot happier than I am. Time for a gut check and take a look at myself. Those are some of my thoughts.
Brian?
One of the important things we've kind of talked around a little bit, and it's always worth bringing up as an aside to this, is the difference between the consequences of sin and the wages of sin. And all of the men here have kind of reminded us that physical defects that are found today that people are born with are the consequence of sin. They're the consequence of sins that Adam committed and brought a curse upon the land. The wages of sin, though, that's the thing we really are supposed to be worried about and thinking about all the time, because it is the wages of sin, Romans 6 and verse 23, which is spiritual death, which is being caught apart. That's the thing God is really concerned about. That's the thing that we ought to be really concerned about. However we live this life, we're all going to die. This life is not, all of us, our bodies are going to fail. All of us are going to experience the facets of these disease, which is ultimately death. We're all going to experience. So there's not an unfairness in the great scheme of things. We're just given a few extra years that some people aren't, or a few extra years of comfort that some people may not have. But in the end, we're all going to perish. God's not so concerned about our death. Indeed, scriptures say things like, precious in the eyes of the Lord are the death of his saints. But God is very concerned about us having the wage of sin. And he has done everything he can to change that. To the degree he has paid for a plan of salvation, he has given us a perfect revelation of it. He has created the perfect support group that we could have. And that's the thing we always want to kind of focus in on. We like to focus in on the physical, but it is that spiritual wage of sin that is the thing we need to be the most obsessed about. That's the thing that we need to consider. And in that circumstance, again, God has done everything he can to bring about our salvation. And we need to appreciate that and look at that as our long goal. I got to throw one last story in, kind of building on what Stephen said, because it's so neat. The story of King David, there's a statement in the scriptures that talk about David hating the lame, because when he besieged the city of Jerusalem the first time, the city of Salem, he was told the lame would repel him. And then there's a statement afterwards. And yet, one of the neat things about David is that David brought that lame son of his close friend Jonathan, Mephibosheth. He brought him to the table. And I love the idea of the idea that sitting at the king's table, his lame legs wouldn't be visible. They'd all be equal in that sense. And there's just something neat about the characteristic that while God might have made these rules in the Old Testament, in the end, God had a great love for all mankind that's explicitly shown by him giving us all a seat at that table. And so there's just something neat to consider in that parallel.
All right. Appreciate those comments. And hopefully we were able to answer this question to your satisfaction. Appreciate you sending it in. All right. That is all the time we have for today. And appreciate the wisdom from the panel today. Guys, any last minute comments before we close out? All right. For those who are wondering why my bookshelf is bare, is because I am moving. And so we've been packing everything up and planning on moving to Huntsville, Alabama area. And so appreciate your prayers, especially for those who are regular viewers of the show might not be seeing me for a little while as we're trying to do the transition and everything, but hopefully we'll be back as soon as possible. That plan is about April is when we're looking to move out. So anyway, guys, appreciate you. We'll catch you next Tuesday on the Ecclesiastes show. Appreciate all the work that's going into that. And for our viewers at home, we want to invite you to tune in to the Monday through Friday Daily Answer with Mark Dunnigan. That drops at 5 a.m. It's on all podcast platforms. And so we would encourage you to check that out. You can search for the Daily Answer or Answering Religious Error. That's the best way to find the show. If by chance it's not on a particular podcast platform that you listen to, please let us know, because we are striving to get it all out there on all platforms. Then on Tuesdays, we have our newest series on the book of Ecclesiastes. We're going to be looking at chapter 5 this upcoming Tuesday. You can check out the archived videos on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter, as well as the podcast that airs after the live show. Then on Wednesdays is an hour worth of answering questions that you send in. If you have a Bible question, you can email us questions@answeringreligiouserror.com or private message us on our Facebook page, facebook.com/answeringreligiouserror. Also, that show airs live on Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter, as well as it is uploaded, the audio-only version, on podcast after the show. And so if you're not able to catch us live, you can catch us in those places. Then on Thursdays, it's Older Women Likewise, it's a show for women by women. And you can find that on YouTube and Facebook and podcast. And that is every Thursday at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. And so we appreciate it if you check out those shows and help support Answering Religious Error by sharing and liking and helping us grow the page, as well as the live videos that we do, especially for today, for our live Bible Q&A. The way these shows continue is by you sending in your questions. And so we appreciate those and look forward to answering all the questions that we get. And if we didn't get to your question today, we will, Lord willing, next week get to that. That's all the time we have for today. Appreciate you, and God bless.